That tall, dark figure at the edge of the woods, the one you glimpse just before it vanishes. Every culture has stories of it. But what if these aren't just stories? What if something has been watching us from the shadows all along? It's 2:17 a.m. The rain is hammering against the library windows like nature itself is demanding entry. Perhaps it wants to warn us about something, or perhaps it wants to wash away what we're about to discover. I'm the archivist, and if you're wondering why you're still awake at this ungodly hour, we're about to explore something the Department of Folklore Studies would rather keep submerged: the urban legend of Slenderman. Did you catch the news last month about those kids in Oregon, Michigan, and Vermont? All reporting the same tall figure at the edges of wooded areas? Officials called it digital contagion, which is bureaucrat speak for kids spending too much time online. But what if those children are seeing something that's been watching us for centuries? What I have before me doesn't look special at first glance. A water-damaged file folder, edges frayed like an old sweater. But this particular folder traveled a long way to reach my desk. Originally from the Department of Folklore Studies at the University of Munich, circa 1938. The folder bears the embossed seal of the Reich Department of Cultural Heritage, with the earlier university letterhead peeking through beneath it like an embarrassed relative at a family reunion. The contents are a methodical blend of German and English text, the latter added later as post-war translations marked with military precision. 37 pages of typewritten reports, 14 hand-drawn sketches, 6 photographs that shouldn't exist, and 1 map with locations that don't appear on any modern atlas. Here's what most people don't understand about internet horror legends. They don't emerge from nothing. The entity we call Slenderman didn't appear fully formed from a forum challenge in 2009. The concept, the fear, the archetype, it's been hiding in our collective nightmares for generations, waiting. This collection was originally compiled in 1938 by Dr. Klaus Steinert's research team, then confiscated by American forces in 1945. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Operation Paperclip wasn't just about rocket scientists, it seems. Getting these files wasn't exactly straightforward. My FOIA requests met with the bureaucratic equivalent of new phone, who dis? 3 denied applications later, I found someone, let's call them a concerned cultural preservationist, who believed this information shouldn't remain buried. And buried is exactly what these files were. Literally, in a waterproof container beneath 3 feet of concrete in a storage facility outside of Baltimore. The margins tell their own story, handwritten notes from at least 7 different analysts over decades. See this blue ink? Department of Unusual Psychology, 1952. The red notations? Air Force Intelligence, 1967. Green ballpoint? CIA Linguistic Analysis, 1978, each agency adding their own lens, their own questions. I've authenticated these documents using every method available to someone without a government lab at their disposal. Paper composition, ink degradation, typewriter key patterns, all match the timeline. The photographs, well, those I had to send to an expert. She said they're genuine. Then she said, she couldn't sleep for 3 days. I should warn you, what follows isn't just another internet ghost story. This is the kind of reading that keeps you checking your closet at 3 a.m. Oh, and about that coffee stain on page 47, it isn't coffee. And it isn't accidental. Someone deliberately obscured 3 names with a liquid that happened to spill in exactly the right pattern. Convenient, don't you think? Let's start at the beginning, or rather, what the file identifies as the beginning, though I suspect this entity is much older than our written records. The first documented section is titled Der Grossmann, Folk Narratives of the Black Forest Region, a rather dry title for what amounts to centuries of terror. Der Grossmann, the tall man, a figure that appears throughout Black Forest folklore from the late 16th century onward. The earliest written account comes from 1764 in the journal of a Lutheran minister named Friedrich Heller. He describes a parishioner's confession regarding a unnaturally tall and thin figure, like a man stretched upon a rack, who watches from between the trees. The minister dismissed it as pagan superstition. 3 weeks later, the parishioner's child vanished. The minister's tone in subsequent entries changes dramatically. Between 1764 and 1902, there are 12 documented encounters, each with consistent details that can't be explained by cultural transmission. The Black Forest region wasn't exactly running fiber optic cable in the 18th century. Villages separated by mountains and days of travel reported identical descriptions: abnormal height, unusually thin, face either absent or featureless, dark attire resembling formal wear. But it's the 1888 account that truly disturbs me. Heinrich Weber was a photographer, an early adopter of the technology, documenting rural German life. His journal, included here in full, describes his 3-week descent from skepticism to terror. June 12, 1888. The villagers speak of an entity in the woods. Superstitious nonsense, but their fear appears genuine. They claim it has been taking children for generations. I promised to photograph this monster if encountered. They did not find my humor appropriate. June 17th. Spent the day photographing at the forest edge. Upon developing the plates, I noticed something unusual in one image. A dark figure standing between distant trees. Likely a villager, though the proportions seem odd. June 20th. Returned to the same location. The atmosphere felt different, colder, no birds singing. Took several exposures. In one, the figure appears closer, much closer. Its limbs seem wrong, too long, too many. June 23rd. Cannot sleep. The figure appeared in my window last night, not outside, reflected in the glass as if standing behind me. When I turned, nothing was there. June 25th. The photographs are changing. The figure's position shifts when I'm not looking at them. God help me. I know how this sounds. Final entry, June 26th. It knows I've seen it. It's coming. If found, tell my wife I... The journal ends there. Weber was found 2 weeks later, wandering the forest road to Freiburg. He had no memory of the preceding month. All his photographic plates were destroyed, save one. It's here in the file. Modern analysts suggest double exposure, primitive editing techniques. But look at the trees around the figure. The shadows fall correctly. The perspective is undistorted. For a photographic accident, it's remarkably intentional. The file continues with analysis of 3 disappearance clusters in the Baden-Württemberg region. 1872, 7 children over 6 months. 1887, 12 children and 3 adults over 8 months. 1904, 9 children over just 3 weeks. Official explanations range from wolf attacks to kidnappings by traveling Roma, because blaming marginalized groups was always easier than facing something unexplainable. A local school teacher, Elizabeth Mayer, collected children's drawings of the tall man between 1895 and 1901. The consistency is unnerving. Children from different villages, different ages, with no contact, produced nearly identical images: stick-like limbs, elongated torso, and that blank face, not just undrawn, but deliberately, carefully erased or filled in. Regional asylum records show a pattern too. Between 1880 and 1910, 23 patients were institutionalized after claiming to be stalked by an unnaturally tall figure. Medical notes dismiss these as shared delusion, though they can't explain how patients with no possible contact shared identical delusions. Perhaps most disturbing are the tree markings. In 5 separate Black Forest locations, trees were found with identical symbols carved into them. A circle with an X through it. Modern Slenderman enthusiasts would recognize it instantly. The file includes bark samples, carbon dated to the 1890s. These weren't recent additions by internet-savvy pranksters. These symbols were waiting in the woods long before the first computer was ever imagined. The Steinert expedition was organized specifically to investigate these markings. And that's where our story turns from historical curiosity to something far more troubling. The Steinert expedition wasn't the kind of academic venture universities typically fund. It was more akin to those reality TV ghost hunting shows, except with actual credentials and methodology instead of night vision theatrics. Dr. Klaus Steinert himself was no paranormal enthusiast, quite the opposite. His academic reputation was built on debunking folklore, explaining the superstitious away with anthropological precision. The University of Munich archives describe him as pathologically rational. His colleagues called him brilliantly dismissive, the kind of man who'd explain away your ghost story before you finish telling it, then hand you a pamphlet on sleep paralysis. In other words, the perfect person to send after legends of a forest entity. Sound effect: pages turning. Steinert assembled a team that could have been plucked from central casting for academics who don't believe in monster stories. Dr. Elise Hoffman, linguistic specialist, Dr. Werner Braun, psychological anthropologist, Hans Fischer, photographer, Marcus Lehmann, field assistant, and 2 graduate students, Friedrich Weber and Anna Schmidt. 7 skeptics entering the woods, a setup so classic you can practically hear the ominous music. Their departure notes from March 15, 1937, read like any optimistic research project: equipment lists, investigation protocols, interview templates for locals. Steinert's initial hypothesis stated clearly: folk entities represent projection of societal fears, particularly those related to child mortality and forest dangers. No supernatural explanation required. That confident tone wouldn't last. Sound effect: chair, creaking as archivist adjusts position. The expedition journal begins normally enough. Daily entries document mundane research activities. Interviews with elderly residents about local legends. Soil samples from sites where markings were reported. Photographic documentation of the forest perimeter. March 18th. Local superstitions appear consistent with standard folklore patterns. Nothing extraordinary. March 22nd. Residents becoming less forthcoming as we move deeper into forest communities. Notable reluctance to discuss Der Grossmann after sunset. March 25th. Unusual weather patterns in northeastern quadrant. Fog remains localized to specific regions regardless of wind patterns. Fisher reports equipment malfunctions when attempting to photograph these areas. Sound effect: papers shuffling. Then, on March 29th, they found the cave. It wasn't on any map. A narrow entrance hidden behind a rockfall that locals claimed was recent, though geological evidence suggested otherwise. Steinert's notes become more detailed, more precise, as if he's trying to anchor himself to scientific observation. Cave entrance approximately 1.2 meters in height, requires crawling for initial 4 meters before opening to chamber approximately 7 meters in diameter. Air quality surprisingly good. No expected wildlife presence. Bats, insects. Unusual acoustic properties. Sounds seemed dampened rather than echoing. Inside, they discovered paintings. Not the expected early human handprints or hunting scenes. These were different. Carbon dating would later place them at approximately 8,000 BCE, predating organized European settlements. The file contains Fisher's photographs, remarkably preserved. On May 13, 1937, the three remaining expedition members, Hoffman, Lehmann, and Schmidt, arrived at the nearest village in a state of extreme psychological distress. They carried nothing but their personal identification and Steinert's journal. According to police reports, they provided conflicting accounts of how they became separated from Steiner. None would return to the forest to guide a search party. Steinert himself was never found. German authorities conducted a 3-week search before officially listing him as missing, presumed deceased due to misadventure in dangerous terrain. What's particularly interesting is what happened afterward. The University of Munich quietly archived the expedition's findings. No academic papers were published. The three survivors never worked together again. Hoffman left academia entirely. Lehmann transferred to administrative duties. Schmidt completed her degree, but her dissertation topic changed from folklore studies to agricultural economics. Most telling of all, the northeastern quadrant of the Black Forest where they conducted their research was declared a restricted ecological preserve by the German government in August 1937. No entry permitted. A designation that remained in effect until after the war, when American forces took a peculiar interest in that specific region. And that's where our story crosses the Atlantic. The American connection isn't just about seized Nazi research. It's about something far more deliberate. A specific interest that would shape how we understand, or fail to understand, what lurks at the edges of our perception. The images show a recurring motif, a disproportionately tall, thin figure surrounded by smaller humanoid forms. In some paintings, the tall figure appears to have multiple appendages, not like limbs, but like tendrils extending from its back. The smaller figures are arranged in concentric circles around it, as if in supplication, or perhaps in offering. Steinert's notes show a shift in tone. These paintings represent sophisticated symbolic thinking inconsistent with known Mesolithic artistic development. The tall entity appears in 23 distinct compositions, always central, always with the same distinctive proportions. The spatial relationship between entity and human figures suggests religious significance. After the cave discovery, the team conducted interviews with elderly villagers from the three nearest settlements. The transcript from 82-year-old Joseph Bauer is included in full. I'll read just a portion. When I was a child, my grandfather told me never to go past the lightning tree, the one split down the middle. He said that's where the forest changes, where it belongs to Der Grossmann. My friend Dieter didn't listen. We were 7. He went past that tree on a dare. We heard him screaming, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. We ran to get our parents. They searched for 3 days, found nothing. 6 months later, Dieter's shoes appeared on his family's doorstep, just the shoes, perfectly clean. The expedition continued its work, systematically mapping the forest region and documenting every folklore mention of the entity. Steinert's journal entries, once clinical and detached, begin showing subtle changes by mid-April. April 14th. Strange dreams last night, unusually vivid. Cannot recall specifics, but woke with sense of being watched, likely effect of local narratives on subconscious. April 19th. Fisher reports seeing unusually tall figure at forest edge during evening photography session. Equipment malfunction prevented documentation. Fisher becoming unreliable, requesting to sleep in my tent. April 26th. Recording equipment captured unusual audio phenomena between 2:13 and 2:17 a.m. No known wildlife produces such sounds. Audio analysis inconclusive. The file includes a partial transcript of this recording, with a note that the original tape was requisitioned by military intelligence in 1945. The transcript simply reads, "Indistinct whispering, multiple voices, possible German and unknown language." By early May, the expedition was unraveling. Fisher and graduate student Weber went missing on May 3rd while photographing the northeastern quadrant. The police report details an extensive search involving 3 villages and military personnel. Nothing was found except Fisher's camera, the film exposed to light, all images destroyed. Steinert's journal becomes increasingly erratic. May 5th. Have been seeing unusual movement at periphery of vision. When I turn, nothing there. Team morale deteriorating. Lehman requests termination of expedition. Hoffman reports equipment tampering, but no evidence of human intrusion in camp. May 7th. Dreams continue. Entity communicates without speaking. Shows me the cave paintings being created. The artists are not painting what they imagine. They are documenting what they see. May 10th. It knows we've seen it. It knows we're documenting it. The act of observation changes the phenomenon being observed. Quantum mechanics applied to folklore. Entity exists because we perceive it. We perceive it because it exists. The final entry, dated May 12th, is nearly illegible. The handwriting degraded from Steinert's usually precise script to frantic scrawling. It stands at the edge of camp every night now. Others don't see it, or won't admit they do. It's taller each time, growing or coming closer. The branches don't move around it. The forest acknowledges its dominion, not supernatural. Undocumented natural phenomenon with psychoactive defense mechanism. Scientific explanation exists, must exist. If not, the entry trails off into a dark pen stroke across the page. When American forces swept through Germany in 1945, they weren't just looking for rocket scientists. Operation Paperclip is well documented as the program that brought Nazi aerospace experts to America. But there was a parallel effort that remains largely unacknowledged: the systematic collection of paranormal research. The Steinert expedition files weren't randomly discovered. They were specifically targeted. According to declassified Army intelligence memos included in this folder, the Black Forest entity was on a priority acquisition list codenamed Tall Harvest, a subset of intelligence gathering focused on what one memo describes as non-conventional psychological warfare possibilities. This wasn't just a few curious officers. This was institutional. The files were transferred directly to Camp King in Oberursel, where intelligence officers conducted debriefings of individuals with first-hand knowledge of the Steinert expedition. Records show they located and interviewed Elise Hoffman on June 17, 1945. The transcript is heavily redacted, but one exchange remains visible. Intelligence officer: did Dr. Steinert express belief that the entity could manifest physical effects through collective perception? Hoffman: he became convinced observation strengthened it. That's why he destroyed most of our documentation before the final night. Officer: yet you preserved his journal. Hoffman: he wanted it preserved. Said someone needed to know what happens when you look too long at something that's been looking back for centuries. By September 1945, the files had been transported to the United States, where they formed part of the foundation for a new research division, the Department of Unusual Psychology. The DUP operated from 1952 to 1978 under various organizational umbrellas, first Army intelligence, then briefly under the CIA, and finally as a special access program with direct Pentagon oversight. What did this department do? According to budget documents, they studied perception-based psychological phenomena with potential defense applications. In plain English, they wanted to understand if belief could create reality, and if so, how to weaponize it. Project TALLBRANCH was their specific initiative focused on the Black Forest entity. The research had 3 phases. Phase 1, 1952 to 1958, historical analysis and subject interviews. They tracked down and interviewed 27 individuals who claimed encounters with unusually tall entities matching the Black Forest description. Subjects included German immigrants, American citizens with no connection to Germany, and 3 Native American tribal elders who described similar entities in their folklore. Phase 2, 1959 to 1967. Controlled exposure experiments. This is where ethics went out the window. The DUP selected test subjects, primarily military personnel, who had agreed to unspecified psychological research, and systematically exposed them to carefully constructed narratives about the entity. No actual claims of supernatural existence were made. Subjects were simply presented with the historical documentation and folklore as case studies. The results were disturbing. Approximately 17% of subjects reported nightmares involving a tall, faceless figure within 2 weeks of exposure. 8% reported visual hallucinations at night or in peripheral vision. 3%, a statistically significant number, reported physical symptoms including nosebleeds, headaches, and in one case, unexplained burns on the subject's back in a pattern resembling elongated finger marks. Phase 3, 1968 to 1978, mimetic contagion testing. The final phase focused on how these perceptions spread between individuals. The DUP created control groups in isolated military installations, introducing the entity concept to key individuals and monitoring how the narrative evolved through social networks. They discovered that certain specific elements remained consistent regardless of how the story spread: the unusual height, the lack of facial features, the association with wooded areas, and most interestingly, the entity's connection to children. A particularly disturbing memo from 1971 notes: the entity concept appears to self-stabilize across transmission. Core features persist regardless of cultural context. This suggests either an underlying psychological archetype or that the concept itself possesses some form of internal consistency that resists mutation. In 1974, DUP researchers conducted what they called environmental seeding, introducing subtle references to the entity in public media. A children's television program included a brief scene of an unusually tall, thin shadow at the edge of a playground. 3 detective novels published by apparently unrelated authors all included minor references to unsolved disappearances involving an unnaturally tall suspect. A forest safety billboard campaign in the Pacific Northwest featured a stylized silhouette watching from between trees. The records indicate this wasn't random. It was systematic testing of how effectively the concept could be introduced into public consciousness and how it might evolve once there. Project Tall Branch ended in 1978 when congressional oversight threatened to expose the program. The DUP was officially disbanded, its records sealed under national security provisions. But there's evidence the research continued under deeper cover. A 1981 memo mentions successful transition of mimetic research to distributed civilian nodes, suggesting they found ways to continue their work through academic and private sector proxies. Perhaps most chilling is a connection I discovered that isn't explicitly stated in these files. Between 1979 and 1983, four former DUP researchers took positions at major technology companies developing early internet infrastructure and protocols. Another three joined university computer science departments specializing in online communication and early social network theory. These were the people who helped build the infrastructure that would eventually become our internet. The perfect medium for mimetic transmission. The perfect environment for an entity that grows stronger the more it is perceived. Fast forward to 1998. Early internet message boards are filled with creepypasta and urban legends. One recurring theme across multiple platforms. Stories of unusually tall, thin figures seen at the edges of forests, near playgrounds, outside bedroom windows at night. No centralized origin, no patient zero. Just scattered reports with those same consistent details that DUP noted remained stable across transmission. Then in 2009, a specific challenge on the Something Awful forums. Create paranormal images. User Victor Surge posts two black and white photos with a tall, faceless figure in a suit. He calls it Slenderman. The internet obsession begins. But was it truly new? Or was it the culmination of decades of psychological seeding? A leaked email from 2012, purportedly between former DUP consultants, simply states, the TALLBRANCH specimen has successfully propagated beyond containment parameters. Digital transmission vastly exceeds projection models. Recommend observation protocols only. Direct interaction no longer advisable. Whether this email is authentic is impossible to verify, but the fact remains. What began as a German folklore study in 1937 somehow became one of the internet's most pervasive modern myths, with precisely the same core attributes documented in the Black Forest over 80 years ago. That's not coincidence. That's cultivation. If the Slenderman phenomenon were simply an internet meme that flourished in 2009, it would hardly be worth our late-night scrutiny. What makes it remarkable isn't just its viral spread, but the consistency with which it has manifested beyond its digital origins. Victor Surge's original forum post should have been the beginning of the story, not its midpoint. His images, a tall figure lurking near playground equipment with tentacle-like appendages barely visible, sparked immediate recognition. Not the kind of recognition you get from something new, but the eerie familiarity of something you've always known but tried to forget. The digital evolution followed a fascinating trajectory. Within 1 month, the original concept expanded across 4 distinct platforms. Within 6 months, it had generated original fiction, photoshopped images, and video content across 17 countries. A digital anthropology study by MIT in 2015 mapped this spread, concluding that Slenderman propagated with unusual mimetic stability compared to other internet phenomena. What does that mean? Simply put, while other internet stories mutated quickly beyond recognition, Slenderman maintained consistent core attributes regardless of who was creating the content. The height, the suit, the facelessness, the association with forests and children, the tentacular appendages. As one researcher noted, it's as if the concept came with its own immune system, resisting significant mutation. The transformation from static images to video was particularly significant. The Marble Hornet series, launched just months after the original forum posts, introduced the visual language that would define the phenomenon: distorted audio, visual glitches, distant figures standing unnaturally still. These weren't random artistic choices. They mimicked the exact perceptual distortions reported by witnesses in the Black Forest accounts: the dampening of sound, the visual irregularities noted in Steinert's journal, the unnaturally static posture, described by Joseph Bauer in 1937. Between 2009 and 2025, there have been 412 documented reports of Slenderman sightings submitted to various paranormal research websites. I've personally analyzed 27 of these reports that included sufficient detail for comparative study. The similarities to historical accounts are unmistakable. A 2014 report from Oregon. It stood at the forest edge behind my house for 3 nights in a row. Each night it seemed closer, though it never appeared to move. On the 3rd night I could see it had no face, just smooth pale skin where features should be. A 2017 report from New Hampshire. Time seemed to slow down. The birds stopped singing. I felt cold even though it was July. It was watching me from between 2 pine trees, impossibly tall and thin. A 2022 report from Michigan. My 6-year-old daughter started talking about the tall man who watches her from outside her window at night. I dismissed it until she drew a picture, the same elongated figure with multiple limbs that I'd seen in my own nightmares as a child, before I'd ever heard of Slenderman. The question becomes, are these individuals simply regurgitating imagery they've consumed online, or is there something more fundamental occurring? Neurological studies conducted at Stanford in 2019 offer intriguing insights. Researchers expose subjects to various fictional entity descriptions while monitoring brain activity. The Slenderman description triggered distinctive responses in the amygdala and visual cortex that weren't present with other fictional monsters. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the lead researcher, noted, "The neural signature suggests recognition rather than novelty. It's as if the brain is saying, 'I know this,' rather than, 'I'm learning this.'" We observed similar patterns when showing subjects images of snakes or spiders, evolutionary threats humans are primed to recognize. I've spoken with 3 psychology experts about what's sometimes called the tulpa effect, the theoretical manifestation of thought forms through collective belief. Their perspectives range from skeptical to disturbing. Dr. James Morrison, University of Chicago. Mass hysteria has documented physiological effects. People can develop real symptoms from believed exposure. What's interesting about Slenderman is not whether it's real in a conventional sense, but how digital connectivity has supercharged the traditional dynamics of shared delusion. Dr. Eliza Kaufman, formerly of Johns Hopkins. There's a boundary between perception and reality that we assume is fixed, but consciousness studies suggest otherwise. If enough minds focus on a specific pattern, that pattern can develop a kind of persistence. Not physical manifestation, but something that exists at the edge of perception where brain activity creates our experience of reality. The most troubling perspective came from Dr. Thomas Reynolds, who worked on classified research programs in the 1980s before joining Yale's psychology department. Some concepts have architectural properties that make them more stable in human consciousness. Think of them as mental viruses that have evolved to resist cognitive immune responses. These patterns can transmit with unusual fidelity across minds, cultures, even generations. The question isn't whether Slenderman exists, but what kind of existence it has. The geographic distribution of modern sightings reveals another layer of this phenomenon. Between 2010 and 2023, reported encounters cluster in 7 distinct regions across North America. When overlaid with historical data, 5 of these clusters correspond to areas with previous folklore about unusually tall forest entities dating back to the 1800s. The Black Hills region of South Dakota shows particular density, with Lakota legends of Walk Sapa, a tall, dark entity that took children who wandered too far from camp, predating European settlement. Even more compelling are the digital artifacts discovered within Slenderman content. Computer security analyst Marcus Way published a 2020 analysis of anomalies found in popular Slenderman videos. Hidden audio frequencies below normal hearing threshold, metadata containing coordinates of historical sighting locations, embedded code fragments that, when extracted, formed partial sentences about collective observation and perceptual amplification. Way's conclusion was unsettling. These aren't random glitches or Easter eggs. They're too consistent across content created by unrelated individuals. Either this represents coordinated effort by multiple creators, or something more unusual is occurring in how this content is being generated. In 2021, a set of emails leaked from a private research group calling itself the Memetic Studies Coalition revealed ongoing scientific interest in the phenomenon. One exchange between researchers stated, "Subject entity continues to demonstrate unusual persistence across digital and physical perception spaces. Recommend continued observation protocol. Direct intervention likely to trigger Streisand amplification." Another email warned, "Digital proliferation has exceeded containment thresholds. Entity has achieved self-sustaining perceptual cycle. Recommend shifting resources to boundary monitoring rather than suppression." Perhaps most disturbing are the physical manifestations reported in recent years. Between 2018 and 2024, forest rangers in 7 national parks documented unusual tree damage, matching the historical patterns noted in the Black Forest files. Trees with identical symbols, circles with X markings, appeared in remote locations. Bark samples were tested. The markings weren't made with modern tools, but rather with stone or bone implements. In 2023, a park ranger in Olympic National Forest found a clearing where trees had been damaged in a perfect circle. At the center was a tall, thin structure made of branches bound with organic material that DNA testing could not precisely identify. The ranger reported equipment malfunctions when attempting to photograph the structure. When a team returned the following day, the entire arrangement had disappeared, with no evidence it had been dismantled by human hands. Dr. Catherine Lin, an environmental scientist who examined the site, stated, "Whatever created this display understood sacred geometry and had extensive knowledge of local plant species. The arrangement included 9 varieties of moss that don't naturally grow together, positioned in specific patterns that corresponded to star alignments visible on the date of discovery." What are we to make of these convergences between historical accounts and modern manifestations? The conventional explanation that the internet simply revived and popularized forgotten folklore seems increasingly inadequate. The specific details, the neurological responses, the geographic clustering, the physical evidence all suggest something more complex than simple cultural transmission. Perhaps most telling is what happened to Victor Surge himself, the original creator. In a rare 2017 interview, he said, "I didn't create Slenderman. I just gave a name and form to something that was already there, waiting at the edges of our collective consciousness. Sometimes I wonder if it chose me rather than the other way around." 6 months after that interview, Victor Surge reportedly began experiencing unusual phenomena in his home: electronics malfunctioning, the sensation of being watched, unusually vivid dreams. He stopped giving interviews. His social media went dormant. According to friends, he moved to an undisclosed location without providing a forwarding address. His final public message, posted at 2:17 a.m. on November 8, 2018, read simply, "It was real before I made it real. It's always been watching. I just taught everyone else to see it too. I'm sorry." So what do we make of all this? A German folklore entity somehow migrates across the Atlantic, gets studied by secret government programs, then emerges as an internet phenomenon that proceeds to manifest in ways that mirror its historical patterns. Coincidence? Cultural transmission? Or something more fundamental? I've spent 3 years piecing together this research, and I've developed what I call the perceptual threshold theory. It goes something like this. Certain concept patterns exist in a liminal space between imagination and reality. They possess specific architectural features that make them unusually stable in human consciousness, what memetics researchers call high-fidelity transmission characteristics. These concepts propagate across minds with minimal mutation, like mental viruses that have evolved perfect keys for our cognitive locks. But here's where it gets interesting. When enough minds engage with these patterns simultaneously, they can cross a threshold from purely conceptual to something with measurable effects on consensus reality. Not full physical manifestation in the conventional sense, but perceptual anomalies that blur the boundary between thought and matter. There are several scientific frameworks that could partially explain this phenomenon without resorting to the supernatural. Quantum observation theory suggests that reality exists in probability states until observed. While typically relevant only at subatomic scales, some theoretical physicists propose that consciousness itself may operate partly at quantum levels, potentially allowing collective observation to influence probability states at larger scales. Neurologically, we know that perception is largely constructive rather than passive. Our brains actively create our experience of reality, filling in gaps and making predictions based on expected patterns. Studies at the University of California have demonstrated that strong expectation can create measurable perceptual effects, including visual and auditory hallucinations in completely healthy individuals. Sociologically, shared belief systems create behavioral changes that can manifest physical effects. This is well documented in religious communities, where shared ritual and belief produce measurable physiological responses, from lowered blood pressure during meditation to synchronized neurological activity during group prayer. The counter-arguments are equally compelling. Occam's razor suggests that cultural transmission, particularly in the internet age, more simply explains the similarities between historical and modern accounts. Human psychology has universal features that naturally converge on similar fear archetypes, and confirmation bias leads us to emphasize similarities while ignoring differences in reported phenomena. What's particularly striking about the Slenderman archetype is how it appears across cultures. I've compiled a 12-point comparison chart of similar entities from global folklore. Der Grossmann, German. Tall, thin, faceless, forest-dwelling, associated with missing children. The Tall Man, English. Abnormally tall, wears dark formal attire, appears at forest edges. Takamaga, Japanese. Unnaturally elongated, lives in forests, distorts perception. Walksapa, Lakota. Dark, tall entity that takes children who wander too far. El Silbón, Venezuelan. Tall, thin, whistling figure who hunts after dark duende, Filipino. Tall variant described as taking children from forests. Gorta, Irish. Unnaturally tall, emaciated figure that brings misfortune. Boneless, Scottish. Formless entity that can elongate itself, associated with night terrors. Bogeyman variants, global. Often described as unusually tall, lurking in shadows. Noparabo, Japanese. Faceless humanoid that induces terror. Kalupalik, Inuit. Takes children who wander too far. Induces memory distortion. Grinning man, American. Tall, unnaturally thin figure reported in connection with UFO sightings. These similarities suggest an underlying mechanism common to all these phenomena, not necessarily that they're all the same thing, but that they may all operate through the same perceptual doorway. The threshold theory proposes that belief operates quantitatively as well as qualitatively. When enough minds engage with a concept pattern with sufficient emotional intensity, that pattern can generate effects beyond pure imagination. The threshold isn't fixed. It varies based on the concept's architectural features and the intensity of engagement. This isn't to suggest that simply believing in something makes it objectively real. Rather, it suggests that the boundary between subjective and objective reality isn't as impermeable as we typically assume. Consciousness itself may be a field-like phenomenon that, when concentrated, can influence probability states at the quantum level, creating cascading effects that manifest as perceptual anomalies or even minor physical effects. I should disclose that my interest in this research isn't purely academic. In 2018, I was cataloging materials from a university archive when I discovered a journal from 1963 describing an unusual phenomenon in rural Vermont. The journal mentioned a tall visitor that multiple families reported seeing at the edges of a forest near an abandoned mining operation. 3 days after reading this journal, I began experiencing unusual dreams. In one particularly vivid episode, I found myself standing in that forest, though I'd never been there physically. At the tree line stood a figure so tall its head was lost among the branches. It had no face, but I knew it was watching me. I knew it had always been watching me. The dreams continued for weeks. Then came the peripheral sightings, glimpses of something tall and dark at the edge of my vision, electronic disturbances in my apartment, the distinct feeling of being observed while I slept. These experiences led me to dig deeper, to find these files, to understand what was happening. Whether the entity had chosen me or whether my research had simply made me more perceptually attuned to it, I can't say with certainty. What I can say is this: whatever the Slenderman phenomenon represents, be it mass hallucination, digital age folklore, psychological projection, or something that defies our current scientific understanding, it demonstrates that reality itself is more malleable, more responsive to collective consciousness than our conventional frameworks acknowledge. Perhaps most disturbing is the acceleration. Digital connectivity increases both the spread and the simultaneous engagement with these concept patterns. If the threshold theory is correct, we may be entering an era where the boundary between imagination and reality becomes increasingly permeable, where sufficient belief doesn't just influence perception, but begins to warp consensus reality itself. The question then becomes not whether Slenderman exists, but what kind of existence it has, and what other patterns might be crossing that threshold as we speak. What are we collectively bringing into being through our shared attention? What happens when billions of minds simultaneously engage with concept patterns that were never meant to be believed by more than a handful of people in isolated communities? I don't have definitive answers. Perhaps no one does. But as you lie in bed tonight, in that liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, you might consider: what exists in the corner of your room when you're not quite looking at it? What stands just outside your window, patiently waiting for you to finally see it? After all, perception goes both ways. We don't just observe, we are also observed. And sometimes, the act of looking calls attention to ourselves. I think that's enough for tonight. These documents should return to their waterproof home, sealed away like the secrets they contain. There's wisdom in containment sometimes. Not everything buried deserves excavation. Not every silence deserves to be filled with words. You might wonder why I spend my nights with these records instead of sleeping like a normal person. Let's just say I have my reasons. When you've seen something standing in your doorway at 3:17 a.m. that shouldn't exist, sleep becomes complicated. Knowledge becomes both poison and antidote. Did you hear that? Probably just the wind. Probably. Here's what troubles me most about the Slenderman phenomenon. The line between documenting and creating has never been thinner. By sharing these files, am I containing knowledge or spreading it? Am I analyzing the entity or feeding it? Perhaps both. Ideas are peculiar organisms. They need minds to survive, attention to grow. Give them enough belief, and they might just step off the page and into the shadows of your bedroom. It's 3:33 a.m. now. I should let you go. Sleep well, if you can. Try not to think about unusually tall figures standing just beyond your window. Try not to imagine what might be watching you from that dark corner you can't quite see from your bed. After all, perception requires both the observed and the observer. And sometimes, in the act of looking for monsters, we teach them how to find us.